A phone slips from Sophie's hand. She catches it before it hits the floor, breath frozen. "Say that again," she whispers into the receiver, hands shaking. On the other end, a voice she wasn't supposed to hear says 3 words that change everything. Footsteps. Close. Getting closer. Sophie shoves the phone into her coat, heart slamming, as the office door creaks open behind her. Sophie had learned to read Seoul before she'd learned to read the men who ran it. She knew which streets went quiet after 9, which elevators had cameras that worked, and which ones only pretended to. She knew that when Choi Seong-ho asked a question in English, he already had the Korean answer prepared, and was only checking whether she'd give it to him straight. 3 months into the job, she still gave it to him straight. That was the whole reason she was still employed. The office was glass and stone, and cold in a way that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Sophie sat across from 2 men from a shipping conglomerate in Busan, converting their careful Korean into careful English and back again, watching the space between what they said and what they meant. Seong-ho sat at the head of the table saying almost nothing, letting silence do the negotiating for him. It was, she'd come to understand, his favorite language. When the meeting ended and the shipping men bowed their way out, Seong-ho didn't thank her. He never did. He simply said, "Tomorrow, same time," and that was the closest thing to approval she'd get. She used to mind. She didn't anymore, or told herself she didn't. It was past 10 by the time she gathered her things. The building had emptied out floor by floor the way it did every night, until it was just her, the hum of the vending machine down the hall, and the particular quiet of a place built for men who didn't like to be overheard. She stood at the window for a moment, looking down at the city doing what it always did without her. Somewhere out there, people were calling their mothers, texting friends about bad dates, complaining to someone about their day. Sophie checked her phone out of habit more than hope. No messages. There rarely were. She thought, not for the first time, that if something went wrong in this building, really wrong, there was no one she could call who would know what to do or even where to look for her. Her family was an ocean away and didn't fully understand what she did for a living. The friends she'd made here were work friends, the kind who asked how you were and meant it only a little. She was, she realized, standing in one of the most dangerous rooms in Seoul, with absolutely no one behind her. She told herself that was fine. Competence didn't need backup. She packed her laptop, checked the hallway out of habit, and didn't yet know how wrong she was. Sophie almost made it to the elevator. She'd forgotten the contract, the Busan translation Sung-ho wanted finalized by morning, sitting exactly where she'd left it, on the small desk in the side office adjoining his own. It was a room she used maybe twice a week, tucked behind a door that didn't quite close all the way, more storage space than office. She doubled back for it without thinking twice. That was the kind of building this was. You doubled back, you didn't ask permission. She heard his voice before she reached the door. Sung-ho didn't raise his voice, ever, but there was a register he'd dropped into when he thought no one could hear him, something looser than the version she translated for all day. Sophie froze with her hand an inch from the handle. She told herself later she should have knocked, announced herself, made a sound. She didn't. Some instinct older than professionalism kept her still. "The building's clear," he was saying in Korean to someone on the other end. "I checked it myself." A pause. "No, this conversation doesn't happen anywhere else. Not on a line I don't control. Not in a room I don't own." Sophie understood, standing there in the near dark, that this was the reason he trusted these walls at 10 at night, not because they were safe from the world, but because he believed he'd emptied them of it. He'd swept the building for outside ears and found none, because he hadn't thought to check for the ones still inside, finishing paperwork he himself had assigned her. The irony arrived a half-second before the words that mattered did. The body was never found because there was no body to find where they looked. I made sure of that myself. Him trusting me was the whole plan. Sophie's fingers tightened around the contract in her hand until the paper creased. Tae-oh still thinks it was the Yosu people, Sung-ho went on, and something in his voice, not guilt, something colder and more efficient than guilt, made Sophie's stomach drop. He's spent 10 years hunting the wrong ghost. Keep it that way. A pause on the line. Then, "Say that again," Sung-ho said, quieter now, and for one terrible second, Sophie thought he meant her, that somehow he'd sensed the door, sensed her breath held wrong in her chest, but he was only asking the caller to repeat a number, an account, something administrative bolted onto the end of a confession like it was nothing at all. Sophie didn't remember deciding to move. She was simply in the hallway, then the stairwell, taking the stairs instead of the elevator because the elevator made a sound, and stairs, if you were careful, did not. The contract was still crushed in her fist. She didn't feel the 11 flights down. She felt only the 3 words looping under everything else, the ones she couldn't yet fully place, the ones that would not let her sleep. Sophie didn't sleep. She lay in the dark of her apartment running the math of it over and over, what she'd heard, what it meant, what it would mean for her if anyone knew she'd heard it, until the numbers stopped adding up to anything but fear. By the time the sun came up, she'd landed on the only strategy she trusted, be exactly who she'd always been, punctual, precise, unremarkable. She arrived 8 minutes early, laptop bag over one shoulder, the Busan contract finally finished and printed, and told herself the version of the story where nothing had changed. Ryu Tae-oh was already in the outer office when she got there, going through the morning schedule with the quiet efficiency he brought to everything. He'd been Seung-ho's second for longer than Sophie had been in Korea, and in 3 months she'd learned exactly one reliable thing about him. He noticed everything and said almost none of it out loud. "Morning," he said, not looking up. "Mr. Choi wants you in for the 10 o'clock, the Yesu account." The name arrived like something dropped from a height. Sophie felt it before she could stop it, a half-second hitch in her hands as she set her bag down, a breath that came in wrong. It was nothing, really, the kind of flinch a tired person might explain away in a dozen ordinary ways, but Tae-oh looked up. He didn't say anything at first. He just watched her with the particular stillness of a man recalibrating something in real time, the way he might notice a door left open a centimeter too wide, or a chair pushed back from a table at the wrong angle. Sophie busied herself with the contract, sliding it across the desk, keeping her face arranged into something professional and blank. "You know the Yesu people?" Tae-oh asked. Not sharp, almost idle. "Only from files. I haven't translated for them directly." True, technically. She heard how careful the sentence was even as she said it, and hoped he didn't. Tae-oh held her gaze a moment longer than the question required. Then he nodded once and went back to the schedule as if nothing had happened at all. But Sophie had spent 3 months learning to read the space between what people said and what they meant, and she understood, walking to her desk with her heart still too loud in her ears, that Tae-oh had just filed something away. Not a suspicion, not yet, just a note, a flinch at a name that shouldn't have meant anything to her. She sat down, opened her laptop, and did not look at the name Yesu again for the rest of the morning, though it stayed there anyway, waiting, the way certain things do once you've heard them said with a body in the room. The 10 o'clock meeting came and went, and Sophie translated the Yosu account documents with hands that betrayed nothing, though she read every line twice, then a third time, looking for the shape of what she'd overheard hidden inside the ordinary language of shipping manifests and quarterly figures. She found nothing. That was almost worse. It meant the truth lived somewhere she couldn't see it from her desk. She told herself she wasn't investigating. Investigating was for people with a plan, an endgame, some idea of what they'd do with what they found. Sophie only wanted to know how much danger she was standing in, the way you'd want to know the depth of water before deciding whether to worry about the current. She wasn't trying to learn Sung-ho's secret, she was trying to learn her own exposure. That justification carried her, 2 afternoons later, into the records room on the 9th floor, ostensibly pulling archived contracts for a client meeting. The Yosu file was there, thicker than it should have been for an account that size. She didn't take it. She photographed 3 pages with her phone held low against her hip, telling herself this was due diligence, the kind any careful employee might do, and not what it actually was. The pages meant little on their own: dates, a settlement paid out a decade ago to a family whose name she didn't recognize, a notation in Sung-ho's own clipped handwriting that had been crossed out and rewritten twice. She didn't understand it. She only understood that it existed, that it had been important enough to bury under paperwork instead of shredding outright, and that not understanding felt, right now, safer than understanding fully. If she knew everything, she'd have to decide what to do with everything. She wasn't ready for that. Later that week, she lingered near Teo's office longer than her errands required, not to eavesdrop exactly, she told herself that too, but to gauge the temperature of the building, whether anything in the air had shifted since the night she'd stood outside that door. Teo was on a call, voice low, and she caught only fragments: an old case number, a name that wasn't Yosu, a request for surveillance footage from 10 years back that the archive apparently no longer had. She kept walking before she could hear more, heart going too fast for someone claiming to be doing nothing wrong. This was the shape of her days now: careful, deliberate, always one step short of actually finding anything, always convincing herself that gathering just enough information to protect herself was different from digging. She believed, the way she'd always believed, that if she stayed precise enough, quiet enough, controlled enough, she could hold all of this without it holding her back. She did not yet understand that a woman who is very good at staying composed is not the same as a woman who is safe. She was about to learn the difference the way most people did, too late to choose it for herself. Teo found her on a Thursday, near the end of the day, when the office had thinned out enough that his presence at her desk felt deliberate rather than incidental. "There's a discrepancy in the Busan contract," he said, setting a printed copy in front of her. "The English version doesn't match what was filed. I need you to redo the translation, tonight if you can." Sophie looked down at the pages before she looked up at him, and it took her a moment to place why the request made something in her chest go still. It was the same contract, the one she'd finished the night she'd doubled back to the side office, the night everything had changed. "Of course," she said, and reached for it, keeping her voice at the exact temperature it always was, helpful, unbothered, the voice of someone with nothing to hide because there was nothing to hide. "Do you know what the discrepancy is? It might be faster if I know what I'm looking for." A clause on page 4, the delivery terms. Teo didn't sit, didn't lean against the desk the way he sometimes did when a conversation was truly casual. He stood the way he stood in doorways, positioned to watch more than to talk. "You finished this late. I remember seeing the timestamp." "I did," Sophie said. "I'd left something in the side office and came back for it, finished the translation while I was there, since I was already at a desk." She let herself shrug, small and easy. Efficient, if nothing else. It was, she thought, a very good lie. Mostly because it wasn't one. Every piece of it was true. She'd simply built a wall around the one piece that wasn't. Teo watched her the way he'd watched her flinch at the name Yesu, cataloging, not accusing. "Long night for a contract," he said. "Long week," Sophie said, and smiled the smile she used for clients who asked personal questions she didn't want to answer, the one that closed a subject without seeming to close anything at all. For a moment, neither of them moved. Sophie held his gaze because she understood, with sudden clarity, that looking away now would cost her more than the lie itself. Teo's stillness had a way of making a room feel smaller, of making silence into its own kind of question, and Sophie realized she was being tested in a way that had nothing to do with contracts. Then he nodded once, the same economical nod he gave to everything he'd decided not to pursue further today. "Page 4, he said again, and walked away. Sophie sat with the document in front of her for a long moment before she started typing, her pulse only now catching up to what she'd just done. She had lied to Ryu Teo's face, cleanly, convincingly, and she understood, with a kind of cold clarity that hadn't been there 3 months ago, that she was no longer someone who simply translated what other people said. She was becoming someone who decided what other people got to know. The chance came the way most chances did in that building, disguised as an ordinary task. Sung-ho asked her to prepare English summaries of the senior staff files for an upcoming investor review, the kind of administrative work that put entire histories in her hands without anyone thinking twice about it. Teo's file was near the top of the stack, thicker than most, the way files belonging to people who'd been somewhere a long time tended to be. Sophie told herself she was only doing her job. She believed it for almost the whole first page. The early biography was straightforward: recruitment date, promotions, commendations written in the clipped, approving language Sung-ho used for people he trusted completely. It was near the bottom of the second page, in a section marked Background, that she found the sentence that stopped her. Joined the organization following the death of Ryu Min-jae in a dispute with a rival Yosu faction. Sophie sat very still. She thought of the name she'd flinched at, the one Teo had watched her flinch at. She thought of the words she'd carried out of that side office 3 months ago, half-formed and unplaceable. Him trusting me was the whole plan. She thought of Sung-ho's voice, low and certain, telling someone the body was never found because there was no body to find where they looked. She went back to the photographs still saved on her phone, the ones she'd told herself were just due diligence, and read the settlement page again with new eyes. A payout, a decade old, to a family whose name she hadn't recognized because she hadn't known to look for it. She searched it now against the personnel file in front of her, and there it was, the same family, the same year, dressed up in the paperwork as compensation for a supplier dispute that had never officially involved anyone at all. Ryu Min-jae hadn't died in a dispute with Yosu. He had died because Sung-ho decided he should, and had spent 10 years letting the man's own son believe otherwise. Had, if the call she'd overheard meant what she now understood it to mean, personally ensured that son rose through the ranks of the very organization built on that lie, kept close, kept loyal, kept hunting a ghost that didn't exist. Sophie set the file down carefully, as though it might make a sound if she moved too fast. She understood, now, why the words had lodged in her the way they had. Not because they were cruel, though they were, but because of what they made her. She wasn't just someone who'd overheard an inconvenient truth. She was the only person outside Sung-ho himself who knew that Ryu Teo had spent a decade being loyal to his father's killer. That kind of knowledge didn't sit quietly. It waited for the moment it would have to be used, one way or another, and Sophie understood, closing the file and squaring its edges with hands that had gone perfectly steady, that the waiting was almost over. Sung-ho summoned her to his office at the end of the day, alone, no documents between them this time. That absence unsettled her more than any file could have. "Sit," he said. And she did, though the word landed less like an invitation than a measurement of how quickly she'd obey, how steady her hands would be when she did. He didn't raise the subject directly. He rarely raised anything directly. It was, she'd learned, how he tested people, circling a thing until it revealed itself in how they flinched around it. "You've been thorough lately," he said. "The staff files, the archive." A pause, unhurried. "Teo mentioned you've been careful with the Yosu account, more careful than the work required." Sophie kept her face arranged the way she'd arranged it for 3 months. "I try to be careful with everything." "Do you?" It wasn't a question. Sung-ho studied her the way he studied contracts, for the clause that didn't match what it should. "I value loyalty, Sophie, more than skill, more than speed. A translator who's merely accurate is replaceable. One I can trust with a silence is not." He let that sit. "I'm asking myself which one you are." She understood in that moment that he wasn't accusing her, not yet. He was fishing in still water, waiting for the smallest ripple to tell him where she was standing. If she answered too smoothly, it would read as rehearsed. If she flinched, it would read as guilt. There was no safe distance between the two. "I've translated everything you've asked me to translate, and I've never repeated a word of it to anyone outside this building." Both true, neither an answer to what he was really asking. Something shifted behind Sung-ho's eyes, not excusing exactly, but recalculation, the look of a man adjusting the weight he'd assigned to a variable. "No," he said finally, almost to himself, "I don't think you have." He rose, signaling the meeting's end, and Sophie stood too fast, then made herself slow down. At the door, his voice reached her one more time, quieter than before. "Teo is the only family I have left in this business," he said. "Whatever you think you understand about this organization, understand that first." Sophie walked out with her pulse roaring in her ears, and only when she was alone in the stairwell did she let herself understand what had just happened. He hadn't caught her in a lie. He'd told her, without meaning to, exactly how far he'd go to protect the one he already had. She requested the meeting herself. That alone told Sung-ho something had changed before she'd said a single word. He received her in the same office, the city glittering behind him through glass that made him look, as it always did, like a man standing above everything he owned. Sophie had rehearsed this a dozen ways walking over, and abandoned every version the moment she sat down. There was no clever framing for what she had to say. There was only saying it. "I know what happened to Ryu Min-jae," she said. The silence that followed had weight to it, the particular density of a room where the wrong word could end things badly. Sung-ho didn't move. "Careful," he said, low. "I'm not here to threaten you." Sophie made herself hold his eyes. "I'm here because I understand exactly what I'm holding and exactly what it's worth, to you and to him. I've kept it for weeks. I could have gone to Teo already. I didn't." "Why not?" It was the first honest question he'd asked her since she'd started the job, and she gave it an honest answer. "Because I don't want to destroy anyone. I want to leave, quietly, permanently, with your word that I'm never a loose end you have to manage later." She let the next part land slow, deliberate. "Your silence toward me, for mine toward him. That's the whole offer." Sung-ho was quiet long enough that Sophie's heartbeat filled the space where his answer should have been. She watched something pass behind his face. Not fear, he wasn't a man built for fear, but the nearest thing to it he likely allowed himself. The calculation of a man realizing the only person outside himself who could unmake his life had just chosen not to, and was asking for almost nothing in return. "You could have used this," he said, "sold it, leveraged it into something larger." "I know." "Why didn't you?" Sophie thought of Teo's stillness in doorways, the 10 years he'd spent hunting a ghost that had never existed, the particular cruelty of a truth that would only ever hurt him and never help him. Because some truths don't set anyone free, they just move who's bleeding. Sung-ho studied her for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost its testing edge. "You'll have your severance, your travel arranged, and my word, which I don't give often, so you should understand what it costs me." A pause. "You're free to go, Sophie, tonight if you'd like." She stood, legs unsteady in a way her voice hadn't been. At the door, his voice reached her one last time. "For what it's worth," Sung-ho said, "I don't think I've ever been more careful hiring anyone in my life. I was wrong about what that carefulness would cost me." Sophie didn't answer. She simply walked out, into a hallway that felt, for the first time in months, entirely her own. Her last morning in the building was quiet in the way endings usually are, not dramatic, just oddly small against the size of what they mean. Sophie cleared her desk of the little that had ever belonged to her there, a charger, a notebook full of half-translated shorthand, nothing that would tell anyone who came after her that she'd existed in this room at all. Teo found her in the hallway on her way out, the way he always seemed to find people, not by accident, but by some quiet instinct for where the important moments in a day would happen. "Leaving," he said. Not a question. "New opportunity," Sophie said, and the lie came easily now, the way lies did once you'd learned exactly how much of yourself to keep behind them. She looked at him a moment longer than the conversation required, aware of everything she knew that he didn't, aware that she was, in this small hallway, the last mercy standing between him and a truth that would break something in him that might never fully reset. She had chosen, deliberately, to let him keep his ghost, not because it was easy, because it was kinder than the alternative, and because some kinds of love, even for people who weren't yours to love, looked exactly like silence. "You were good at this job," Teo said, which, from him, was closer to eulogy than compliment. "I know," Sophie said, and meant it differently than he'd intended. He held out a hand, and she shook it, and there was nothing in his grip that suggested he'd ever know how close he'd come to a truth that would have unmade him. Sophie let herself feel the full weight of that mercy, hers to give, hers alone to carry, as she walked past him toward the elevator for the last time. Sung-ho didn't see her out, she hadn't expected him to, but as the doors closed on the glass and stone of the only empire she'd ever stood close enough to touch, Sophie understood that she was leaving as someone fundamentally different from the woman who'd first walked in 3 months ago. Competent, controlled, and entirely alone. She wasn't alone anymore, not in the way that mattered. She'd learned in the coldest room in Seoul that safety was never something you waited to be given. It was something you built, deliberately, out of exactly what you knew and exactly when you chose to say it. The doors opened onto the lobby, and the city outside was exactly as loud and indifferent as it had always been. Sophie stepped into it anyway, and for the first time in months, it felt like walking towards something instead of away from it. Some silences protect the people who keep them, others protect the people they're kept for. Sophie learned to tell the difference the hard way, in a building built on one man's carefully buried truth and one woman's decision about what to do with a secret that was never hers to carry in the first place.
If Sophie's story stayed with you, hit subscribe for more, and tell me in the comments, would you have told Teo the truth or protected him with the same silence Sophie chose? Silence Speaks Stories, where every story leaves a mark.